Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Janina, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Welcome back, wine friends, and back by popular demand, I bring you a flashcard-style episode for anyone studying their WSET Diploma. So before, across the last few years, I've covered fortified wines and sparkling wines. Those episodes I will list in the show notes. But I've been asked again and again to tackle the wine regions of the world. Now, this is a much bigger challenge. There is so much to cover, but fear not, over the course of this year, and well, probably the next and the next after that, I will drop in an episode like this one, diving deep into specific regions and grapes. Now today, as many of us are in the depths of winter, I thought it's the perfect time to escape, well, at least mentally, to somewhere warm and sunny. So we're going to take a deep dive into the Languedoc Roussillon region of France, looking at the grapes, the terroirs, and the appellations, and everything you need to know if you're studying or if you just want to geek out over French wine. This isn't just for diploma students though. Whether you want to test your knowledge, get inspired for tasting, or understand what to focus on if you were to take your exams, this episode is for you. Before we start, here is your fun fact. The Languedoc Roussillon region is huge. In fact, there are more hectares under vine than any other individual country like South Africa, Chile, Argentina, Australia. It has 224,000 hectares, and you are going to find 205,000 of those hectares in the Languedoc. Now, if you're enjoying these episodes, please do leave a review or rating on your podcast app. Send me a message on Instagram at eatsleep_winerepeat, or drop me an email, Janina at eatsleepwinerepeat.co.uk. Let me know what the next flashcard episode you would want to listen to. But before we dive in today, a quick thank you to Zeno Alcohol Liberated Wines, who are sponsoring today's episode. And as I said last week, I'm really happy to be giving them a little bit of space because at the end of January, now probably your New Year glow has worn off, but this is the point when you get to ask yourself what habits actually feel sustainable. And so for many people right now, that does include drinking less alcohol, hopefully better, or as I mentioned on last week's episode, zebra striping. Honestly, I just love the name. This is where you alternate alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks. But the issue is always, if you do want something non-alcoholic, the flavor. And with non-alcoholic red wines, this is usually where things really fall apart. They are too sweet and they are too thin, which is why the Zeno Tempranillo Cabernet 2024 actually surprised me. It is honestly the best non-alcoholic red that I have tried so far. First of all, it actually smells like wine, not sugar. You get this kind of wild, slightly tart red currants and black currants, a little touch of cracked black pepper, and then there is something quite savoury. And then on the palate, there is actually fruit from start to finish, and it is not too thin. It's juicy, it's balanced, and there's even a little bit of this dusty, tannic finish. So yes, it's not red wine with alcohol, but it does feel a little grown up, and because of the structure, really possible to have with food. Now, Zeno works from organic vineyards to glass, focuses on terroir and varietal purity, uses very low sugar and a gentle de-alcoholization process that protects the wine rather than stripping it away, as I mentioned last week. But you don't have to listen to me. You can listen to the LIWC, the London International Wine Competition, and the World Alcohol Free Awards, who both gave this red a gold, or the Guild of Fine Foods, which awarded this an unprecedented 2-star Great Taste Award. And as I mentioned before, Zeno has been named Non-Alcoholic Producer of the Year 2025 with the LIWC, as well as Alcohol-Free Wine of the Year at the Luxury Awards. So, see what you think. If you're in the UK, you can get these wines from Waitrose and Waitrose Cellar online. And whatever you choose this year, drink well and enjoy this episode. So let's start by discussing the climate in the Languedoc. We are down in the south of France. So how much is it raining? How sunny is it? Are there any specific winds that make a difference? Well, the answer is the Languedoc is a Mediterranean climate. So you're going to have high levels of sunshine. In terms of rain, we are talking about 600 millimeters a year, and there is a cool, dry, northwesterly wind called the Tramontane, and this blows for about 200 days per year. So consequently, there is quite low disease pressure in these vineyards, so fungal diseases aren't such a problem. And that also means that many vineyards can be organic and spray a lot less. And here's a fun fact for you. The Languedoc and Roussillon are responsible for 1/3 of the whole of France's organic viticulture. However, there is a negative to the fact that it rains a lot less typically in this region, and that is, well, in very dry years with super low rainfall, limited water means limited photosynthesis. Your vine needs water to move nutrients and keep its leaves hydrated. Water stress can reduce berry size. There are very many knock-on effects when there is very little water, because it basically just pushes the vine into survival mode. And you may be interested to know that during the years of 2005 and 2015, there was a survey of yields for AOC wines, and the Languedoc and Roussillon had the lowest yields of all of the French regions, roughly half that of Champagne or Alsace. So let's get on to the AOCs and the IGP. So if anyone is following along and not quite doing their diploma, AOC stands for Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée. This is France's highest, most tightly regulated quality category. So there are specific grapes, how they're supposed to be grown, what the yield limits are, the minimum alcohol levels, how it's made. So it's all about protecting tradition, terroir, typicity. The IGP stands for Indication Géographique Protégée, and this is a step below AOC in terms of strictness, but it's still tied to a geographical area. So the producers in an IGP, they can have more freedom with grape varieties and styles and winemaking techniques. So my question for everyone now is, how much of the Languedoc in a percentage is an AOC? The answer is 15% of total production, because actually there's a large volume of wine that is produced as IGP. And cooperatives here are highly significant, especially in the 1950s when they were responsible for 90% of the output. Even now they produce around, do you want to guess the percentage? About 60% of the area's wine. And after 1973, when France stopped importing wine from Algeria, Languedoc, along with the Roussillon, became the country's main source of everyday drinking wine. Overproduction relative to demand eventually resulted in the removal of many vineyards, leaving the total vineyard area at roughly half of what it was in 1968, which is crazy considering how large it is now. Today, the production of inexpensive wine exists alongside a growing focus on small-scale, high-quality wines. There are some absolutely cracking, superb wines being made down here in the Languedoc for you to seek out. So let's focus a little bit more on the IGP wines, which actually represent 70% of the production in the Languedoc. What are the maximum yields allowed for white, red, and rosé. Now, these are more flexible than for AOC wines. Do you know what they are? The answer is the maximum yields for white and red are up to 90 hectolitres per hectare. And for rosé, they can go up as high as 100 hectolitres. Now, they are allowed to use up to 58 different grape varieties. And with the flexibility of all these grapes and being able to produce higher yields, it does mean the prices of these wines can be more affordable. You may have heard of the regional IGP Pays. This is the biggest producer of IGP wines. It produces 10 to 15% of all French wine. Yes, 10 to 15% of all French wine. That had to be said twice. And if you're interested in what colour is coming out of this IGP, more than half is red, about a quarter is white wine, and then a little under a quarter is rosé. And in terms of the single varietal wines, what are the top four? I'll let you think for a second. The answer is Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, and Syrah. Now, if you want to test yourself and think of the remaining grapes coming out, I'll pause for a second. But the answer is, following Syrah, you have Grenache Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, Cinsault, and after that, a small percentage of Pinot Noir, Viognier, Marcelin, Cabernet Franc, Grenache Blanc, Muscat Blanc à Petit Grain, Carignan, Colombard, Rolle, also known as Vermentino, and Malbec. However, full disclosure, after giving you that list, that is me listing the main grape varieties and then the order they are used for IGP Pays wines. But keep in mind, if we are talking about the Languedoc, my question to you now is, what are the most grown varieties within the whole region? The number one is Syrah, and then followed by Grenache Noir, Merlot, Carignan, Cabernet Sauvignon, and then we get a white grape, which is Chardonnay. Now, talking about all these individual grape varieties, these are allowed within IGP wines, but did you know that AOC wines of the Languedoc are always blends, or at least in the case of red wines? And right now, we're going to focus on red wines because that is at least 90% of the production of each region, unless it is specifically a white wine region such as Picpoul de Pinet. So, how many grape varieties are required as a minimum for a wine that is an AOC? The answer is 2 grape varieties, and at least one must be a principal variety. And most appellations, they set a maximum percentage of any single variety. And the AOC may also set minimum or maximum amounts for individual varieties or for certain combinations. Now, apart from the special cases of Cabardès AOC and Malepère AOC, all Languedoc appellations require one grape variety that is red in the blend. What is it? The answer is Grenache Noir. And most also require Syrah and Mourvèdre. Now, in many appellations, these 3, so Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, form the group of principal varieties. So let me repeat that again. Most Languedoc appellations require Grenache Noir, Syrah, and Mourvèdre as the 3 that form the principal grape varieties. However, that is not the case for Corbières AOC and Fitou AOC. So what is the principal grape variety? It is Carignan. And you will also find that Carignan in nearly all other appellations is at least allowed in the blend. Now, within an appellation, there are subzones, and just to keep us on our toes, the rules can differ. So, an example being in Saint-Chinian-Roquebrune AOC, that's a mouthful, they require a higher combined percentage of Grenache Noir, Syrah and Mourvèdre than the broader Saint-Chinian AOC. The required percentages for grape varieties in the vineyard can be different from those in the final wine. For instance, an AOC might demand that 50% of a variety be planted in the vineyard, but only require 40% of it in the finished wine. So this gives producers some flexibility. Grapes not used for the AOC wine can go into rosé, IGP wines, or Vin de France, which is the basic category of French table wine. And it just means that the winemakers have freedom to experiment without any geographical constraints. Now, last thing on yields. This is for you guys doing your exams. Pause this and have a think about what are the maximum yields of hectolitres per hectare. I am now going to give you some answers. So, most AOCs have a maximum yield of 45-50 hectolitres per hectare, but some of those subzones, they're going to be even lower, around 40 hectolitres per hectare. The regional Languedoc AOC allows 50 hectolitres per hectare for red wines, and do you know how many for whites? It is 60 hectolitres per hectare. But reality check, we did say that these are some of the lowest yields in France. So although there are the maximum yields set, real yields are much lower, often around 35 hectolitres per hectare, because of that low rainfall and the poor low fertility soils. Now let's look at the AOCs, and we're going to go from west all the way through to the east of Languedoc. There are two AOCs producing a lot of red wine in the west that are much more affected by the Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean. So what two AOCs are these? That is Malepère and Cabardès. Now the question is, what are the grape varieties in these two appellations? Because they are very different to everything else in the Languedoc. Well, this is where you find the Bordeaux varieties, but they are grown alongside more typical Languedoc varieties as well. So looking at Malepère AOC, this climate is really influenced by the Atlantic as it's protected from the Mediterranean influences by mountains. And the wine needs to be a blend of at least two varieties with a minimum of 40% of what grape variety? That's Merlot. Now, Cabardès AOC is just north of Malepère, and this doesn't have the mountain range blocking it, and so it has both Atlantic and Mediterranean influences. Now, are you aware of the percentages of grape varieties? Well, it needs to be at least 40% Bordeaux varieties, so that's your Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. Then the next 40% must be made up of Grenache Noir and or Syrah. For any of you taking your exams, I feel you. I remember this. It is tough to remember these percentages. Right, before we carry on going east, just south of Malepère is Limoux. Now, this is an important appellation. It is best known for sparkling wine, though. So this would be in your sparkling wine exams if you were taking the diploma. But for those of you just listening because you are wine geeks and want to learn, this is where the world's first sparkling wine was made in 1531 in the Abbey of Saint-Hilaire with the Benedictine monks. And this is a region that makes Crémant de Limoux, Blanquette de Limoux, and Blanquette de Limoux Méthode Ancestrale. But we won't cover this now, but anyone who's interested, you can find Chenin Blanc in this region, Morzac, so there's some other great varieties to explore. But back to the AOCs in the diploma exams. So let's go on to Corbières AOC. So pause this and have a think about what are the grape varieties used, what is the appellation like in terms of hills and mountain ranges and altitude. And when you're ready, I'm just going to tell you the answers. So this is quite a hilly appellation. With over 10,000 hectares, it is in fact the 4th largest in France. Now, there are 2 mountain ranges to know about. With my wonderful pronunciation, I would call it the Touche and the D'Alaric. You're going to have vines planted up to 450 metres above sea level. Because of that altitude, there's some cooling influence. There is also cold northern winds. So all of this is going to help to retain acidity in the grapes. Now, 90%, as we kind of mentioned before, is red wine. So at least 40% of the final wine must be any of those principal grape varieties. So that is Carignan, Grenache Noir, Mourvèdre, and Syrah. And then the remainder have to come from their other permitted varieties, and that can include Sanso, but only up to a maximum of 20%. And we were talking about maximum yields. I'm sorry, I'm going to bring it back again. But nice and simply, for red, rosé, and white wine, it is 50 hectolitres per hectare. Now, there is an incredible sub-appellation within Corbières. What is it? So this is Corbières-Boutenac, and this requires Carignan. Carignan is king. It's always the primary grape variety, and Carignan, Grenache Noir, and Mourvèdre make up to 70% of the blend, but Carignan is always going to be king here. Now, in Corbières AOC, can you make rosé and white wines? Yes. And what are the grape varieties that you will find here? You will find Bourboulenc, Grenache Blanc, Marsanne, Roussanne, and Rolle. Now, which AOC is actually split into 2 areas? The answer is Fitou. Now, Fitou, the 2 areas are south and east of Corbières, with a little bit of Corbières in between the 2 areas. And below Fitou is Roussillon, which we will get to afterwards. Now, these 2 areas actually produce different styles of wines, but are still using the same grape varieties. So what are they? You have the traditional variety Carignan. This needs to be what percentage of a blend? Between 10 to 40% is going to be your Carignan. And then Grenache Noir, which is going to be a minimum of 20%. Now have a think. What are the differences in soils and in altitude that are going to affect the different styles of Fitou? So in the coastal area, Fitou is relatively flat. You've got low-lying plains, and the soils are made up of clay and limestone. They also have good water retention. And what this means for the wines, they're going to be a little bit less concentrated than those that are inland. So what do you find inland? Well, the inland region of Fitou is more mountainous. It is less fertile, and you have these fast draining soils made up of schist. Now, this means that often the wines from this region have a little bit more concentration in flavour. Now, there is another coastal AOC that is right next to Corbières, this time to the north of Corbières. What is this appellation called? This is Le Clap. Now, 80% of the wine here is red. However, This is a region that is also known for its whites. But starting with red, what is the main grape variety? Well, Mourvèdre does really well here. And why? What is the climate like? Well, it's really warm, it's sunny, it's arid, and it is windy. But I said this is also a region for white wines. So what are the grape varieties? You will find a white wine is made up of a minimum of 60% Grenache Blanc and or Bourbon. Now let's talk about the quite large and diverse region just north of Corbières, not directly on the coast, but the more eastern side is going to have the effects from the Mediterranean, the more cool Atlantic influenced foothills of the Montagne Noire. What region am I talking about? This is Minervois, named after the Greek goddess Minerva. And actually, this is an area with so much history. Do check it out. But let us get back to the grape varieties. There is the typical 3-grape blend here. What is that? We are talking about Grenache Noir, Syrah, and Mourvèdre. But there is also slightly less common red grape variety that grows here, and I had to look this one up. It is a hairy version of Grenache. What is it called? This is called Yedonné Pelout. Go and check that one out. Now the wine blend has to be at least 2 varieties, including at least one of the principal varieties. Principal varieties being Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre. But alongside those 3, Carignan and Cinsault can totally be used. And of those 5 varieties, they must make up at least 50% of the final blend. However, no one grape variety can exceed which percent in the blend? That is 80%. Now, what is the sub-region within Minervois? This is the Minervois-La Livinière AOC. And what colour wine are they making? In this AOC, it is only red wine. Now, are the grape varieties used here the same? Yes, they are. And again, one grape variety cannot exceed 80%. However, just to double check, what are the percentage of grape varieties that can be used in the blend? Well, those 3 principal grape varieties have to make up at least 40%. However, across the 5 main varieties we've mentioned, Grenache, Mourvèdre, Syrah, Carignan and Cinsault, they must make up at least 80% of the blend. So, Minervois-La Livinière is going to have at least 80% of those red grape varieties that we mentioned, whereas Minervois AOC has to have at least 50%. Now, the other difference is the terroir. What is aspect like? Altitude, soil types? Well, the answer is the grapes are planted at around 400 meters of altitude on gentle slopes. They are limestone terraces, and here you get good drainage, exposure to the sun, and you get still some cooling influences from the altitude. And so, with the cooler temperatures, this can mean that the grapes have higher acidity levels. So typically, the wines from Minervois-La Livinière can offer a little added freshness than what you might get from the Minervois AOC wines that grow at lower, warmer parts of the region. Now, what is the next region along northeast of Minervois? This is Saint-Chinian. And there is the northern zone and the southern zone with different terroirs affecting the style of wines. In the northern zone, there are 2 of the smaller sub-appellations. What are they called? One is Saint-Chinian Roquebrune The other is Saint-Chinian-Berlou. So, what are the differences in soils affecting the northern and southern zone wines? Well, the northern zone has arid, fast-draining schist soils. This means that you're going to get lower yields and typically the wines are more concentrated. Whereas in the southern area, the soils are clay and limestone. You have a greater water holding capacity, typically higher yields, and so slightly less concentrated wines. Now we're nearly done, guys. Stay with me. What appellation is northeast of Saint-Chinian? The answer is Corbières, AOC. Now, what is the altitude like? What are the soils? What is the style of wine? So, grapes are typically planted at about 250 to 400 meters of altitude. The soils are made of schist, they're low fertility, they're well draining, so therefore you typically get good concentration in your wine. And touching on yields again, just for a second, I promise. The maximum yields are 50 hectolitres per hectare, but the average here is much lower, typically around 33 hectolitres per hectare. And here, there is a high proportion of certified organic grape growing vineyards. Around 40% of the vineyards are already organic, with 10% in conversion. And how long does the wine have to age before it can be released? The answer is 1 year. Now we're going to go a little further northeast again. What is this region? It is a pretty new appellation that can only make one colour. So what is that? I am talking about Terrasses du Larzac, and they are only currently making red wines at the moment. Now, as this appellation only got its status in 2014, there's still a lot of work defining categories. Are they going to allow in white wines and define that? But currently, right now, red wines just need to be a blend of 3 red varieties. But this is a region to check out. It is very exciting. Now, what is the defining terroir climate aspect here that makes a difference? Well, this place has great diurnal range with up to a 20 degrees Celsius difference in the summer between day and night. And this is going to give you really ripe fruit flavors and that gorgeous fresh acidity. There's a whole range of different altitudes, but many vineyards are planted from 120 meters up to around 400 meters above sea level. Now we get to the last red appellation, and this is the most eastern. It is also slightly different in terms of climate from the rest. What region is this? I am talking about Pic Saint-Loup. This has a continental climate, and with its cold winters, warm summers, and so much rain, how much rainfall does this region have? About 1,000 millimeters a year. And so this is actually very similar in terms of climate to the northern Rhone. So what grape variety do you think is planted here? This is a wine made from Syrah, and it must be at least 50% of the final blend. This is a region just for red and for rosé. And seeing as it doesn't make any white, let us go to the white appellation to finish off. Which region am I talking about? This is Picpoul de Pinet, where you will find vineyards planted on low-lying land close to the coast. The grape variety is what? Probably, as many of you have guessed, it is the Picpoul Blanc grape variety. If you are living in the UK, you will have definitely seen this grape variety because it is in a distinctive, long, thin, green bottle. We receive most exports. 60% of the wine is exported, and the UK is the number one market, so you are likely to find it at the pub. Now, what does Picpoul Blanc taste like? Well, According to the WSET Diploma, this is a dry wine, medium-bodied, with medium plus to high acidity and medium intensity lemon fruit with light floral notes. The wine is acceptable to good in quality and inexpensive to medium priced. Now, they won't be testing you this in your diploma, but for those of you that love fresh wines with a slight saline zing, look out for the Picpoul de Pinet Patience tier. This is a new premium level of Picpoul. The bottles will be brown. They have to be tasted to qualify. They have to be aged for longer, and they're much more complex and gastronomic. You'll find lees aging, lees stirring with these wines. So not in the diploma, but do go and check those wines out. Now we're going to slowly finish up with the Roussillon region, which is south. It is just below the Languedoc as we get to Spain. So what is the main mountain range that affects where all the vineyards are planted? This is the Pyrenees. And in terms of sizing, this is a much smaller region than Languedoc. It is 21,000 hectares. However, interesting fact, this is a third of the size of what the Roussillon was in the 1980s. So much has been pulled out. Typically, the old way to plant vines were bush vines. In the last few decades, more vines have been trellised, but in the Roussillon, there is a lot less flatlands than there are in the Languedoc. And equally, that means that the Languedoc can produce a lot more inexpensive wines, but it is harder for the Roussillon region. Now, I've probably already given it away. Are the vines planted on slopes? Are they on foothills? Yes, they are. And in terms of the percentage of AOC vineyards, this accounts for what percentage of the Roussillon region? This is 70%. One thing that's also worth keeping in mind, a quarter of the region is dedicated to Vin Doux Naturel wine. So these are the fortified, natural, sweet wines. But that is something that if you are doing your diploma, you'll be asked about in your fortified wine exams. If we are talking about reds, whites and rosés, reds dominate, followed by a little bit of rosé and a tiny amount of white wine. You're going to get equal volumes of the AOC wines and the IGP wines here. This is an important region for the cooperatives. How much do they account for? Well, about 75% of the production here. Now let's look at the climate again. Pause this if you are testing yourself. What is the climate like? It is warm, it is windy. This is a Mediterranean climate, so loads of sun. Drought can be an issue here, in fact, increasingly so year by year it seems. And how much rainfall? Well, around 500 to 600 millimetres of rain. So with the sunshine, with the rain, there is low disease pressure. This also means there's a higher percentage of organic vineyards. Over 15% of the vineyards are certified. And what about the grapes? Well, we're not far from the Languedoc. I'm thinking you might be able to guess, but the most important ones are Grenache Noir, Syrah, Carignan and Mourvèdre. But Muscat and the Muscat family, they play a very important role for the fortified wines. And for the small amount of white wine that is made, Macabeo is important. Now, this is also the same as Macabeo, as they call it in Catalonia, but also in Rioja, Spain, the same grape variety is called Viura. Now we have just 3 AOCs to look at and 1 IGP. Are you ready? And then we are done. So the Côtes du Roussillon, this is the largest appellation. And it covers the entire department of the Pyrenees Orientales, except for the one little AOC that we are going to touch on in a moment. Now, the quality, the styles of the red wines are very similar to what you're going to find in the Languedoc AOC. But what are the main grape varieties that are used and the rules in the vineyard, the yields? Well, the answer, not so surprisingly, is Carignan, Grenache Noir, Mourvèdre and Syrah are the principal grape varieties. However, a maximum amount of Carignan is allowed in the vineyard, so no more than 50%, and Syrah and Mourvèdre, separately or together, must make a minimum of 25% of the plantings in the vineyard area. You have to, again, make your wine with a minimum of 2 grape varieties, and the highest percentage cannot be more than 80% of the final blend. Now, yields. 48 hectolitres per hectare is the maximum, but it is worth pointing out I'm talking about the red grapes as this is the highest percentage of what is made, but white wines and rosé are made here. And where are the vines planted? Well, typically around the lower slopes. 100 to 250 metres is where you're going to find them. Now, the next appellation is Côtes du Roussillon Villages. This is less than half the size of the Côtes du Roussillon. It is for red wine only. And you'll be happy to know that the rules are the same in terms of having at least 2 grape varieties in the blend, and the main variety cannot be more than 80%. But what is the difference here? So vines are typically planted between 100 and 400 metres. You typically have more cooling influence, therefore higher acidity in the wines, fresher flavours, more work has to be done by hand, so the costs are slightly higher. The maximum yield is slightly less compared to 48 hectolitres. Here in the Village appellation, it is 45 hectolitres per hectare. But due to the hot, dry climate, the yields are typically lower and you get a nice high concentration of flavour in your wines. There are, in fact, 5 villages that can put their name to this appellation. So one example would be the Côtes du Roussillon Villages, Toteval. Now they come with a lower maximum yield. What is this? The answer is 42 hectolitres per hectare. And there's an interesting fact with Carignan here. So some of these villages, they require that Carignan is to be made with carbonic maceration. The idea to promote the primary fruit and reduce the tannins that might be extracted. Now on to the small little appellation. What is it called? This is called Collioure, and you're going to find it along the coast to the Spanish border. In fact, it has the same boundaries as Bagnols, which is an appellation for fortified sweet wines, the Vin Doux Naturel. The wines from this little appellation are full-bodied, they're dry, red and white wines, and the grapes are grown on steep terraces above the Mediterranean Sea. So predominantly red wine is the majority, and you probably can guess the grape varieties in it. It is Grenache Noir, Syrah and Mourvèdre. But for the white wines, what is the main grape variety used? That is Grenache Gris, and they have the same maximum yield for red and white wines. What is that? So this is the lowest of all in the Roussillon. This is 40 hectolitres per hectare. But again, the low rainfall, the poor soils in this region, and the heat, you typically get an average of 20 to 25 hectolitres per hectare. So this is an appellation of low yields, high concentration and high quality wines. Now to finish off, I'll let your brain rest and simply tell you, you just need to know about the IGP Côtes Catalanes, which covers the whole Pyrenees-Orientales department, and they are making red and white wine there. And there's even some super premium white wines. I do hope all those numbers, percentages and appellations have been useful, or at least did not send you to sleep. Next week you won't be challenged by quite as many statistics, but you will be learning something completely new. We are heading to Croatia. Have you ever tried a wine from there? Do you know any of the indigenous grapes? Well, my guest certainly has. He is an American-Croatian wine critic and writer whose first book was on the wines of Dalmatia. Michael Houdin. So next week's episode is going to be a fantastic beginner's guide, a crash course into Croatian wine. And as always, we'll finish with a quote, but let's actually make it a French proverb since we're still in French wine territory. And translated into English, it says, "The best use of bad wine is to drive away poor relations." Well, I think we can all agree that's also excellent advice for 2026. Now remember, wine is meant to be savoured, shared, and to make your life just a little more enjoyable. So keep curious, stay inspired, and pour yourself a glass that makes you smile. Until next week, wine friends, cheers to you.